So Tottenham took their first loss of the season yesterday, 1-0 at home to Bournemouth on an incredibly frustrating afternoon. And look, it's not the end of the world. I'm going to make this video fairly short and succinct because I don't want to sort of drag it out too long. Because to be honest with you, I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think there's issues that we have realised from this game. I want to talk about the first phase of possession where I think Thomas Frank got it slightly wrong, where new players coming through the door would help to improve us in a game like yesterday. But you know, it's a learning curve. It's a learning curve for Thomas Frank at the end of the day. I think he did set us up wrong in this game and some of the issues I'm going to talk about today. I think, you know, we're not going to see that. And I think he spoke about that in his post-game interviews yesterday. I think, he said about the first phase of possession where Tottenham got it wrong yesterday, the lack of intensity and much more. So I want to touch on all of that in this video. But first things first, you've got to give credit to Bournemouth. Credit where credit is due. They were excellent out of possession. The way that they pressed us, the way that they knew they could hurt us yesterday. I'm sure Areola saw that lineup and went, perfect. That is absolutely perfect for the game plan that they had. They went 1-0 up early, and we were lucky to only lose that game 1-0, to be honest. Being in the stadium yesterday, it was bleak. It really was bleak. There was not much to get excited about at all. It was such a flat game. We had one shot on target, and that came in the 69th minute or whatever it was from Lucas Bergvall. We just never really looked like we were going to get back into that game and score. And if anything, it only looked like Bournemouth were going to increase their lead. But a few good Vicario saves kind of kept us in it. And then the last 15 minutes, we pushed forward and we did look a little bit better. But it was too little, too late at that point. But I think, let's get straight into the issues. Because I think the first big issue yesterday was the first phase of possession. We were really, really struggling to build up and break out of that intense Bournemouth press. They pressed us very, very hard at the pitch. They, made it so difficult for us to play out. But part of that problem was the players and the profiles that we had on the pitch. They didn't really allow us to, have that comfortability in that first phase of possession and beat such a good press like Bournemouth were, because the very few times we did break through, there was space in behind. If you broke through that first phase of the press with Bournemouth, if you got the ball to Sarr in these positions, Kudus in these positions, if you had another player potentially playing in that number 10 role, if you had a James Maddison yesterday or a Xavi Simons coming into the side, if you got them the ball in these sort of areas, there was space to hurt Bournemouth there, absolutely. And we've seen that with Bournemouth over the past year and a half since Areola came in and took over, that they are vulnerable once you beat that first phase. But we just could not beat that first phase of possession. So often the ball was coming out here to Romero or coming out here to Van der Ven, and he was looking for passing options. And there was just nothing. There was absolutely nothing. So they turn and play back, and Bournemouth would just press higher and higher up the pitch. They'd win the ball back, or they'd force a mistake for Spurs, and the ball would either go out for a throw-in, or we were just not able to build up and get out of that and sustain pressure in Bournemouth's half and sort of build those attacks and sustain those attacks, which is so important to do when you're at home, and especially when you go down 1-0 after the 4th minute and when you're trying to get back into the game. It was a constant struggle. I think the midfield was probably the biggest issue in this. João Paulinho and Rodrigo Bentancur, whilst they absolutely serve their purpose as players, and I spoke about this when João Paulinho was signed, I said, for certain game states, Man City away is the best example of it. He's amazing, and the qualities that he's got, are really sort of on display and shown in a game like that. But in a game like Bournemouth at home, when you need your midfielders to be so good in that first phase and so comfortable on the ball and beat that press and really give us the best chance possible of breaking out of that and sustaining pressure in Bournemouth's half so that they can't press us as high up the pitch and sort of disrupt their game plan. João Paulinho was just nowhere to be seen yesterday, unfortunately. Really, really poor on the ball, wasn't showing for it enough, wasn't confident enough. When he was receiving the ball, he was scared to turn. He was just playing the ball backwards to Romero, to Pedro Porro, sort of almost just shifting that responsibility on to somebody else. Rodrigo Bentancur was exactly the same. Sarr was not able to get into the game from that 10 position again. You need a creative spark. You need somebody, again, who's super, super comfortable on the ball, receiving it on the half turn in that 10 area in a game like yesterday's when, somebody like a Tyler Adams was so tight to Sarr at lots of points, when Bournemouth's midfield was pressing up and you don't have time on the ball, and their centre-halves were getting onto Pap Sarr in the middle of the pitch, and Pap Sarr wasn't able to affect the game. Again, in that 10 role, I love him in that kind of role against the Man City, against those top teams away from home when, it's very transitional, big focus on ball carrying, big focus on that third midfielder almost becoming part of a deeper lying midfield three, and, a lot of the owners being on them defensively. But, you know, Xavi Simons starts that game, essentially. As soon as he's through the door, he starts that game. If Kulusevski was fit, he starts that game in there. You drop Papsara into that midfield pivot. But I think that also demonstrated where a lot of Spurs fans, myself included, were saying we needed a deep line passer, you know, a deep line playmaker in that 6 role alongside a signing like João Paulinho this summer. It's an area where we are weaker in our squad 100%. And, you know, I think it would have been the right thing to do yesterday to probably take Bentancur out and start a Bergvall, because whilst Bergvall is not, you know, not the best part, you know, it's not the best element of his game, his passing and, you know, punching the ball through the lines. You know, he's brave on the ball, and he would have done that to a better degree than Rodrigo Bentancur would, and he is much more confident at dropping and receiving in these areas and beating a man and, you know, carrying the ball through that press, and that would have been something that would have benefited us yesterday. It wouldn't have solved all of our issues, but that absolutely should have been a profile that was utilised yesterday. And, you know, even an Archie Gray could have potentially done that job better as well. You saw him do it against Burnley. It was not to the same degree, and Bournemouth is so much better out of possession than Burnley are, but that should have been the way that we went yesterday. And again, I think Thomas Frank will learn from that. He had Bergvall warming up intensely at half-time, and then brought Bergvall on, within 10 minutes of the second half, because he knew that was the area that had to improve. But even then, you know, when Bergvall came on, he put Bergvall in the 10 and he dropped Sarr into that double pivot, which I just thought was the wrong move, because we needed that ball progression from deeper. It wasn't about having a more creative player in here. It was about having someone to break through this first line of the Bournemouth press. And, you know, as they tied, we were able to do that more easily naturally, but in the first 60, 65 minutes of the game, we just weren't able to settle into any sort of rhythm, because, you know, Van der Ven, Romero, their passing lanes were just completely cut off, and Bournemouth nullified that threat because they knew that Bentancur and Paulinho weren't going to be able to break their press, and so they got so much joy out of that. And that is definitely an area that is going to be changed. And in these home games where there is more onus on Tottenham to build up from the back, to have more of the possession, you know, we had like 65% possession yesterday, and it felt like we had about 30 because of how little we were able to use of it, and how little we were able to turn that into good possession and attacks and, you know, hurting Bournemouth. Well, I mean, it was ridiculous how little we actually hurt Bournemouth yesterday. But, you know, in a game like that, you know, have a Paulinho in there, that's fine, but also have a Bergvall in there, have a Xavi Simons in the number 10, or have a Sarr and Bergvall pivot or whatever. And yeah, that will come, and I think that is a learning curve for Thomas Frank, and I think that he'll be much more aware of that heading into, you know, the games after the international break, that is more necessary. And you can't play a midfield 3 of Paulinho, Bentancur and Sarr at home in those sort of games. It just won't work, and it's not comfortable enough in the first phase of possession, breaking out from the back against that kind of press. And, you know, Romero and Porro, I thought normally when you have a midfield like that, and, you know, you're relying on, you know, those passes coming from deeper, going over the top, Romero and Porro are poor for their usual standards on the ball yesterday, and that didn't help us. When the ball was being fired up to Richarlison to help us relieve some of that pressure, Richarlison was so bad with the build-up yesterday, so bad. The ball was just not sticking with him. You know, we've seen him excel in, you know, weeks, you know, Burnley, Man City, he was doing excellently with his hold-up play, but against Bournemouth, he was just, to be honest with you, he was getting bullied by Senesi and by Diakate, Bournemouth centre-halves, and he wasn't able to make anything stick. He was falling over far too easily, losing balance too easily. He wasn't able to bring other players into the game. And we massively missed the presence of somebody like a Dominic Solanke yesterday, because, you know, whatever pros Richarlison has in his game, that is where Solanke excels. The ball sticks to Solanke. He brings other players into the game. He helps you get out in games like that. And you saw that at so many points last season with Ange Postecoglou's Tottenham, and how key Solanke was in that role. And Richarlison just wasn't giving us anywhere near enough. And I think if Solanke was on the bench and he was fit, first of all, I think he was fit, he starts the game. And second of all, I think if he's on the bench, he comes on in that, you know, for the second half, in that 55th, 60th minute, and he improves us in that area. I also thought, you know, we saw it against Burnley and it really didn't work, and he tried to go with it again, the Spence and Johnson left-hand side, and Brennan Johnson yesterday, I mean, oh my God, he was bad. Like, nothing was staying with him. You know, when you have a player like Jed Spence who likes to get on the overlap and he likes to sort of give and go with the winger, he likes to fire the ball into Johnson's feet and then go round him. Johnson isn't comfortable enough on the ball to do that. And then when Spence overlaps, you know, you're looking for a player to drive inside the pitch. And Johnson just, again, he just doesn't have that within his game. And he's really uncomfortable when he receives the ball. And that's still such a huge element of where so many Spurs fans get so frustrated with Brennan Johnson, and a Spence and Johnson left-hand side in those kind of games, at home in those kind of games, when, you know, the focus is on possession, on build-up, you need a winger to be super comfortable on the ball and to, again, allow the team to progress up the pitch. Brennan Johnson is not that. And I think when Wilson Odobert came on and when Udogie came on as well, that greatly improved. And look, I'm not saying Wilson Odobert is perfect. I'm not saying he's the answer necessarily, but he is certainly a better option in that kind of game, in that kind of situation, than Brennan Johnson is, because there was way too much pressure put on Mohamed Kudus yesterday. And whilst, you know, he had a great last 20 minutes, you know, creating things, you know, causing issues down that right-hand side, Bournemouth knew again that they could sort of double up on him and pretty much nullify Tottenham's threat. And Tottenham's, you know, ball carrying on the transition, or, you know, trying to play out from the back, they were just nullifying that threat in Kudus, and we didn't really have much else, not on the left-hand side and not through the centre of the pitch. So again, that was part of Bournemouth's game plan. It really worked, but it was just super frustrating. And having an Odobert on that side, or playing a Johnson with an Udogie, would have been a lot better as well. But, you know, it was just frustrating yesterday. The whole thing was just frustrating. We just looked so uncomfortable on the ball. We just looked so void of ideas. And by the time the subs came on, Odobert, Tell, etc., we started looking a little bit better. Bournemouth started to tire. But by that point, it was too little, too late. And even then, we didn't really create many chances. We obviously had that Tell snapshot near the end of the game that went just wide, which was a great effort, to be fair to him. But again, Odobert had that chance too, where he blazed it over the bar that he should have done a lot better with. But I thought Odobert was good coming on. I thought he gave us a lot more in terms of when Jed Spence or when Udogie came on as well, just firing the ball into Odobert. And Odobert, you know, his first touch, face up the man, and he was comfortable. You know, the fullback knew that they had time, because Odobert, you know, gives you more time on the ball. He, you know, his touches are better. He's a lot more comfortable. He can stand up his man. You know, the fullback will be less snappy with Odobert, because he knows that he can get out of Brennan Johnson, whereas if he tries to go at an Odobert has the feet to get out of those situations, and the fullback knows they have more time to get round the outside. They also know that, you know, Odobert can drive inside the pitch, which is just attributes that Brennan Johnson doesn't have. And look, Johnson gives you so much. He gives you a goal-scoring threat in a game like Man City. Once again, it was kind of like this team is set up great for a, you know, transitional style of football, when we're the team sitting deeper, when we are sort of, you know, there's not as much pressure on us to build out from the back. And against a team like City, it worked perfectly, and you saw that against City. But at home especially, and especially against teams that we are expected to have more possession against, where there's more pressure on us to break them down, these kind of profiles, Johnson, Sarr in the 10, you know, have Sarr in the double pivot, absolutely, but in the 10, these kind of profiles aren't going to work for you as well in these sort of games. I don't think we'll see this midfield three at home again very often at all. You know, moving forward this season, I think Xavi Simons will make a huge difference. Obviously, if we sign another winger, you know, if we sign an Ademola Lookman or somebody who's a lot more comfortable on the ball out there, I think you'll see them play a lot, or Wilson Odobert play a lot out wide in these sorts of games too. So I just think it's a learning curve for Thomas Frank. I think it's, you know, about sussing out how to get better in that first phase in these type of games, how to, you know, penetrate teams, how to hurt teams more, the sort of profiles that he likes in there. And this sort of side, again, like I said, will work against the top 6 sides away from home, for example, against the top 6 sides at home, right? Against teams that we are naturally going to have less possession against, try and hurt them in different ways. That side will work, but it's about coming up with, you know, plans and, you know, giving the right profiles, putting the right profiles on the pitch to hurt teams like Bournemouth. And Bournemouth's game plan was great yesterday. It worked perfectly. But I hope to see a reaction. You know, when we're playing West Ham, you know, the same thing will happen. There'll be more onus on us to have the ball. And I expect to see those profiles come in against West Ham and for us to look a lot better. And I think Thomas Frank is aware of that. And I think he's absolutely a good enough manager to make those changes, to adapt to those circumstances. And I think you saw him during the game yesterday realising that, bringing on Bergwijn, bringing on Odobert, you know, with plenty of time left in the game. It just, again, like I said, it was just almost too little, too late. So, you know, in terms of the final few days of the transfer window, I think that another attacker is key, of course. I think that, you know, getting Xavi Simons fully bedded in. I know that he's going away with the Netherlands on international duty, but when he comes back in that week's preparation for West Ham, it's about getting those players settled in, getting them used to the system. I'd expect to see Simons starting against West Ham, and you know, if we signed another attacker as well, then they'll definitely be in with a shout of starting in that game too. So, look, I don't want to dwell on it too much. It's frustrating, but we're going into the international break with 2 wins out of our first 3 games. It's not the end of the world at all. It's a learning curve for Thomas Frank. Hopefully we get better in dealing with these kind of situations, dealing with teams being intense with us at home, pressing us high when they know that we're weak in areas like that in the first phase when we got that kind of team out. And hopefully it's about adapting to that and becoming a lot more comfortable in these sort of games and in these sort of environments at home. And yeah, we'll see improvements definitely. Like I said, not the end of the world. Go in, don't dwell on it too much. I know it's absolutely typical Tottenham losing right before the international break. It's just classic, to be honest. But I think we'll see improvements, and I think that we'll be just fine this season in games like this, and especially when we've got players like Solanke back. Simons is in the fold, another attacking signing, like I said. So yeah, if you are new here, subscribe would be greatly appreciated. I'm on a road to 5,000 subscribers, so you could help me out on that journey. That would be greatly appreciated. Like the video as well if you did enjoy it, and yeah, I will see you in the next one.